Time to get back in the barn.
Yeah, Barry reached chapter 27. We've been back and forth about who was going to do the introductions of Bruce, and I wasn't sure if I'd be here or not. I got state night for me, and plus I had a high school deal. But anyhow, to kind of a sidetrack, I'm trying to think about where I first met Bruce, which led me to recollect about how this thing came about. And some of you have been here from the very beginning. But after the first go-around in 1991 with the Persian Gulf, we didn't want to be around for all the yellow ribbon tying going around town. And so one of our members, Roy Wolf, got us into Wilder Forest. And so we went out to Wilder Forest and had a retreat that summer of 1992, I guess it was. And then we continued. That was a great deal for us. And we had a circle there and talks around the fire. It was a really nice time. We continued that for several years. And then eventually, I forget what the reason was, but we were no longer able to go to Wilder Forest. So then we floundered. I had a couple at my house, picnics, 4th of July get-togethers, and then Paul Hager picked it up over in Hager City, and he titled it Peacestock, with having a pig roast over at the farm in Hager City. And then eventually Bill got involved with it, and then he's kind of taken it by the lead ever since. So, we thank Bill for continuing on with this event every year, and he's done a great job of keeping it alive. But anyway, I thought with Bruce, I was almost certain that it was at the Wilder Forest that we first met, but I still haven't nailed it down. Steve tells me that it was later, maybe it was at Peacestock. But at any rate, I think I met Bruce at one of these type of events. And I'm just going to read something briefly here. About Bruce. Bruce Gagnon is the coordinator and co-founder of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. Bruce has worked on space issues for 34 years. He has traveled to and spoken within 24 countries, including throughout the United States. He has also traveled to 17 universities and colleges, campuses throughout the world, raising awareness of the need to resist the nuclearization and weaponization of space by all countries. That's what he does in his part-time. This guy is unbelievable. He's like a full-time activist. I've been with Bruce. People that know about Jeju Island and the building of the Navy base out there. Bruce has been out there multiple times, taking groups and risking civil disobedience. He's just a radical. He's involved with Veterans for Peace. He's just such a great role model. And then we just recently had an action, as Bob talked about earlier in the day. We had an anti-war rally, National Veterans for Peace in D.C., and of course Bruce was there. But anyhow, he's a smart, dedicated. Just contributes his whole life. Plus, he's really smart. And he's an Air Force vet. Is that right, Bruce? But anyhow, so let's have Bruce come forward and educate us. Oh, there you go.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is so great to be here today. I'm really thrilled to be here. It's a great honor and a lot of fun to be with all of you. I live in Bath, Maine. I lived in Florida for 30 years, but moved. I was a single dad, and after my son went off to college, I was ready to get out of Florida. Tough place to live. And I moved to Maine along with my partner, Mary Beth Sullivan. People ask me now, why you moved here from Florida? Because most people are heading the other way. Why'd you do that? And I always say, the weather. Which is true. So, yeah, there we go. Okay, I got to move a little more. Yeah. Don't pull it back anymore. The wire. Oh, okay. Yeah, got it. This should do it. All right. Yeah, I was in the Air Force. Joined the Air Force in 1971. My dad was a lifer in the Air Force. And so I grew up in that environment. I was a young Republican for Nixon in 1968. So I was a right-winger when I tried to join the Air Force, flunked my induction physical because of an old high school football injury. So I had to get a waiver to get into the military when most people of good sense were trying to stay out of the military. But after my training, I was sent to a base in California that was an airlift base for the war, Travis Air Force Base. And the day I checked into the barracks, they kept apologizing to me repeatedly. "I'm sorry, man, we'll get you out of here as soon as we can. It's the only room we have left." And we walked down this long, dark hallway, last door on the left. And we walked in, and there were anti-war posters all over the wall. And as it turned out, this was one of the leading organizers in the GI resistance movement at Travis Air Force Base, publishing a newspaper called Travesty that would go under the doors at night. And so at night there would be a knock on the door, and white guys would come in with chairs and sit in a circle and talk about the war. I'm sitting in the corner, this young Republican for Nixon from a military family. Another night there would be a knock on the door, and they would be black guys from the cities, Black Panthers, talking about racism in America and in the military. And again, I'm sitting in the corner. And then they started smoking marijuana. I had heard of marijuana before. And you know, we've learned a lot over the years about the effects of secondhand smoke on innocent bystanders. So after that, my life was changed. Within a few months, my chair moved into their circle. I became an anti-war activist. I asked to be released from the military as a conscientious objector about 6 months in. And they asked me, "Well, what's your family history? Are you from a traditional peace church, you know, the Brethren, the Mennonites, Quakers?" No, I'm, from a military family. I was a young Republican for Nixon. So they turned me down, and I didn't know enough to know any better. So I did 3.5 years what I called hard time, because after I figured out what was happening in Vietnam, it was real hard being there. After I got out, I went back to Florida, where my family had retired, and I was going to college, University of Florida, just ready to graduate, when I got recruited by the United Farm Workers Union, Cesar Chavez's union, to become an organizer of fruit pickers in Florida. So I quit college, never to return, never to finish, never to graduate, to become an organizer. That was 1978, and I've been one ever since. And I can't ever say enough how grateful I am to have led this life. I'm so very lucky. In 1983, I began working full-time on space issues with the Florida Coalition for Peace and Justice. And so I'd like to share with you now some of the things I've learned over the years about what our government is doing today and where it's heading in the future. Why are we witnessing the massive demonization of Russia today? Could one key reason be because it has the largest supply of natural gas on the planet? I think you went one too far. Yeah. With the melting of the Arctic ice, the oil industry is eager to drill, baby, drill in the region. But Russia holds the largest land border with the Arctic. A study by the Rand Corporation calls for the balkanization of Russia to make it easier for the oil companies to gain access. The Navy has developed a plan for the domination of the Arctic. Admiral Jonathan Greenert, former chief of naval operations, told the New York Times in 2014, quote, "In our lifetime, what was in effect land and prohibitive to navigate or explore is becoming an ocean, and we'd better understand it. We need to be sure that our sensors, weapons, and people are proficient in this part of the world," unquote, so that we can, quote, "own the undersea domain and get anywhere there," unquote. Russia is thus seen as an obstacle to that domination. Another likely reason for the nonstop demonization of Russia is the development of the new Silk Road highway connecting China, Russia, and Europe. This enormous potential trade zone would sideline the U.S. at a time when our economy is already on shaky ground. BRICS, which stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, is an alternative global economic structure that is seen by the West as a rival to the corporate IMF and World Bank. BRICS would give loans to developing nations without the usual demands for privatization of their economic assets and austerity cuts in social spending. The U.S. sees BRICS as a major rival to its current unipolar control. BRICS has declared that they intend to usher in a multipolar world. In the past year, we've seen the takedown of Brazil's President Dilma Rousseff, and she has been replaced by a corporate-friendly operative. At the same time, we've witnessed in recent years the globalization of NATO. NATO is now reaching into Eastern Europe, not only to encircle Russia, but also setting up partner relationships in the Asia-Pacific with Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and other countries aimed towards China. It was Bill Clinton that broke the promise to Russia that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. This promise was made by former U.S. Secretary of State Jim Baker to former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev when the Berlin Wall fell down. It was this assurance that made Gorbachev agree to the reunification of Germany. The U.S. has recently been shipping huge amounts of warfighting hardware to Eastern Europe and storing it in Poland, which has become the new hub for Pentagon operations in the region. Note that recently Trump, just last week, went to Poland before attending the G20 meeting in Hamburg, talking about our special relationship. The military hardware has been moved by rail and along the public highways as a show to Russia that NATO is pointing a loaded gun at Moscow's head. War games are increasing along or near the Russian border as these countries host U.S. or NATO military bases. This slide is from a Pentagon website and shows the number of recent war exercises across Central and Eastern Europe. One such war game was held last year in Poland called Anaconda 16. Troops from various NATO member states are brought into these military exercises. In late February, Germany announced it was sending tanks near the Russian border. Imagine how that goes over as the Russian people recall losing 27 million citizens from Hitler's invasion during World War II. At the same time, the U.S. and NATO have been expanding their military war games throughout the Nordic region. Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and even Finland are increasingly being brought into the steroidal NATO alliance. Just as Poland has become a hub for U.S. military operations and a depot to store U.S. equipment, the same is happening in Norway, near the Russian border. When Russia reacts defensively and holds military exercises inside their own country, near the borders of Baltic states or Ukraine, they're accused of being provocative. Imagine if Russia or China were building military bases in Canada or Mexico or Cuba. Washington would go ballistic. Not only are conventional military bases being established along the Russian border, but so are U.S. missile defense systems. MD, missile defense, is the shield that would be used after a Pentagon first strike attack is launched against Russia or China. Previously, under the ABM Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty between the U.S. and Russia, neither side was allowed to have more than one MD deployment inside of their own country and none outside of their country, because MD would give one side an advantage over the other. But when George W. Bush became president, he pulled the U.S. out of the ABM Treaty. And since that time, particularly during the Obama administration, U.S. MD deployments have been rapidly advancing up against Russia and China. Recently, we saw very excitedly, just last week, the United Nations voting to ban the bomb. But Russia and China for years have been telling the world that if you continue to encircle us with missile defense systems, you put our retaliatory capability in jeopardy. We will not be able to enter any negotiations to reduce our nuclear forces as long as so-called missile defense is being used to encircle us. There are various kinds of MD systems, some with better testing rates than others. One of the more successful systems are the Navy Aegis destroyer-based interceptors. In 2008, the Pentagon shot an old U.S. satellite out of space with the interceptors on board an Aegis destroyer to show the world that it has anti-satellite weapons capability. These warships are built in my hometown of Bath, Maine. Today, the U.S. is putting these warships in the Mediterranean, the Baltic, the Black Seas, near Russia, and sending them to the Asia Pacific to encircle China. Obama decided to develop a program called Aegis Ashore, where they would deploy these same ship-based missile defense interceptors on land because their testing rates were higher. They were better than most of the other missile defense systems. In 2016, the U.S. Aegis Ashore deployment site was opened in Romania. Also, this site will be able to fire cruise missiles, which are admittedly first strike attack weapons, flying essentially at treetop level, under radar. So Russia is saying, we don't know in Romania whether this place has cruise missiles or so-called missile defense interceptors. We have no way of knowing what's in the launch tubes. So how are we to respond? This year, a similar Aegis Ashore deployment site is being built in Poland. It almost looks like they're digging a grave. Just 2 nights ago, I learned that U.S. is also now moving missile defense to Lithuania. So they will be deployed on the land in Lithuania, Romania, and Poland, and on these warships throughout the region encircling Russia. The radars to make these missile defense systems function are now based in Turkey, the United Kingdom, and Norway. The Pentagon maintains that these deployments are not aimed at Russia, but instead are intended to protect from mythical nuclear missiles that would be fired from Iran. All of these missile defense systems, in fact, everything the Pentagon does these days, is controlled and directed by U.S. military satellites. So troops on the ground, troops on our ships, U.S. airplanes, drones, cyberspace operations, everything today is run through military space satellites. And as the satellites orbit the Earth, they talk to and relay signals to ground stations all over the planet that have been set up, that then help relay these signals in real time, split-second time, to the warfighter. All of these systems give the Pentagon a clear advantage when they consider doing preemptive attacks of another nation, as Bush did in 2003, shock and awe of Iraq. There's growing talk by about the Pentagon putting actual offensive weapons in space, like this one they call rods from God. Tungsten steel rods would be fired towards Earth to take out Russian or Chinese underground nuclear missiles in a first strike attack. STRATCOM, Strategic Command, at Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, Nebraska, is now in charge of a program called Prompt Global Strike. The mission is to be able to hit targets anywhere on Earth in less than an hour. The U.S. also has a growing cyber warfare program that is increasingly soaking up tens of billions of dollars in the Pentagon budget. And you can see on here, it's all about offense. It's all about denying the adversary the ability to communicate in war. The Space Command brags that the U.S. leads the world in cyber warfare technology developments. Although, if you listen closely, all we hear is that Russia and China are cyber attacking us all the time. Oh my God, they've taken control of everything, cyber, everything else. But we are leading the pack. A cyber command was created in 2009, a separate command, to carry out this program. And the headquarters today is based at Fort Meade, Maryland. In this 1997 Space Command planning document, Vision for 2020, they maintain that the U.S. will control and dominate space and deny other countries the use of space. The document maintains that the United States will be the master of space. This is the headquarters building of the Space Command in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Norway's Svalbard Island has become a major U.S. intelligence gathering outpost. This violates the 1920 treaty between Norway and Russia that said the island could never be militarized. This downlink base at Svalbard is used to intercept all communications from Russia and beyond, and helps relay signals from military satellites to battlefield commanders. Also in northern Norway is a U.S. radar station in the village of Vardo that is used for the Pentagon's missile defense targeting program. The radar is called HAV-STARE. You can see the proximity of Vardo to Russia up in the top, the red arrow. So all over the world today, the U.S. has well over 800 military bases outside of our borders. Russia, at most, has 4 or 5 bases outside of its border. Now I want to talk to you about Ukraine, because it's fundamental to everything the United States is doing today. The U.S. led a coup d'etat in Ukraine in 2014 and installed a puppet regime that immediately passed a law declaring that the speaking of Russian inside Ukraine was illegal. Citizens in eastern Ukraine, this red area at the top, Lugansk, Donetsk, Mariupol, is what they call the Donbass. So citizens in the Donbass and in Crimea and then in Odessa, further down on the left, began to peacefully gather signatures on petitions and hold protest marches saying they wanted a federated Ukraine where they could elect their own local mayors and governors rather than having them appointed by the new right-wing regime that the U.S. installed in Kiev. Historically, the people of Western Ukraine followed a World War II Nazi collaborator named Stefan Bandera, whose forces joined the Nazi army invasion of Russia. As World War II approached, Bandera made an alliance with the Nazi powers. They formed several military formations so that when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, Bandera had several battalions in the city of Lviv at the time, where their base was located. There's documented history of the Bandera forces participating in the identification and rounding up of Jews in that city and assisting in executing several thousand citizens. They were also involved in liquidating Polish populations in other parts of Western Ukraine during the war. Obviously, these Bandera supporters today don't hold total power in Kiev, but they have significant roles in the new government, particularly in the security agencies. In fact, the U.S. connections to these Nazis goes back to World War II, and the United States has had a long-standing tie to them through the intelligence agencies, initially the OSS and other military intelligence, and later the CIA. Part of this story is shared in a very important book that I cannot recommend highly enough, called The Devil's Chessboard, Allen Dulles, the CIA, and the Rise of American Secret Government by David Talbot. Many of these Nazi death squads today were sent to eastern Ukraine to try to quell the peaceful protests that were happening soon after the coup d'etat in 2014. And they began killing innocent Russian-speaking fellow Ukrainians in 2014. American politicians like John McCain, Lindsey Graham, Vice President Joe Biden, and others have continually supported these Nazi leaders. And today they maintain that the U.S. should do more to arm them. Obama and Hillary Clinton's, at that time, Undersecretary of State for European Affairs, Victoria Nuland, was in charge of the Ukraine coup operation. In this photo, note the event was sponsored by Chevron and Exxon. Exxon logo's on the left. You can't quite see it as well. She told the assembled on this occasion that the U.S. spent $5 billion bringing about the change in Ukraine. At first, Russia did not get directly involved, but after the Nazi death squads began killing people in eastern Ukraine, Moscow began to arm the people there who had been coal miners, electricians, shopkeepers, teachers, musicians, and the like, as they tried to defend themselves against this U.S.-backed death squads from Western Ukraine, these Nazi death squads. Citizens in Crimea then quickly held a referendum and voted 94% to reunite with Russia. On May 2nd, 2014, people gathered outside the trades hall in Odessa, Ukraine. They were tabling and gathering petition signatures for the idea of a federalized Ukraine. Hundreds of neo-Nazis were brought from Western Ukraine to Odessa, and they attacked those outside the trades hall. The people ran inside the hall to protect themselves. Outside, young Western Ukrainian nationalist women were making Molotov cocktails for the men to throw at the trades hall. Soon the building was on fire, and the smoke inside was making it hard to breathe. Fire trucks from a nearby fire station were blocked by the neo-Nazis. People came to the windows to try to get some air. Some of the neo-Nazis on the ground were caught on video shooting guns at the people in the windows. Some jumped from the windows to escape the fire and the smoke and were beaten with bats when they hit the ground. Many of them were killed. A group of neo-Nazis went through a side door into the trades hall, and they were wearing gas masks that they just happened to have with them that day. They killed people inside the hall by stabbing them and beating them to death. To this day, not one person has been prosecuted for these crimes, where more than 50 were killed and many, many were injured, even though there is massive video and photographic evidence of those who committed these violent acts. The right-wing government in Kiev has killed all investigations, and in recent months has begun arresting some of the parents of the victims in Odessa. On May 2nd, 2016, 2 years after the massacre, I joined 2 other Americans and many other international observers from other nations to stand with the mothers of these Odessa victims as they once again demanded real investigations and justice. Amazingly, we were not allowed to get closer than a couple hundred yards of the trades hall, and we were blocked by the very Nazi death squad battalions who committed these crimes. Today, U.S. Army Special Forces soldiers from Fort Carson, Colorado, are rotated in and out of a base in western Ukraine that is now a training ground for Ukraine's National Guard. The National Guard did not even exist until about a year ago or so, and was created by moving the by moving the Nazis from the death squads into the formal Ukrainian military. In this photo, you see the U.S.'s puppet president, Poroshenko, giving the thumbs up. And next to him on the left is Obama's ambassador, Piot, who just has recently left Ukraine following the election of Donald Trump. In this photo are U.S. Army trainers from Fort Carson, Colorado. One of my friends from Maine has a son in the Army, Special Forces, and today he is at this very base as a trainer. He's a sniper. Here's a photo of Senator John McCain. It's a very, very recent photo, just a few months ago. Lindsey Graham from South Carolina, and someone you might recognize, meeting with these Ukrainian National Guard, giving them the blessings from the U.S. government. You know her, huh? In recent days, Ukraine's puppet government has been sending more military hardware to the Donbass, and shelling the civilian populations there has been increasing. Now we're talking about shelling of apartment blocks, hospitals, daycare centers, senior citizen homes, train stations, airport, all civilian targets. They've killed thousands of people. All you have to do is go online, Google shelling of the Donbass, shelling of eastern Ukraine, and you will see testimonies of the people in their homes who have been shelled by these U.S.-supported forces. The U.S. has taken over Ukraine lock, stock, and barrel. Even the Ukraine Security Bureau headquarters building in Kiev now has an American flag hanging over the doorway. The U.S. goal in Ukraine is to create chaos along the Russian border, trying to draw Moscow into a fight that will trigger a NATO excuse to react militarily. You've seen how NATO is being prepared to go to war with Russia. Putin has been successfully demonized just like we saw in Panama with Noriega, in Yugoslavia, in Iraq, in Libya, in North Korea, and now in Syria. The U.S. sees the writing on the wall and recognizes that its unipolar control of the world is collapsing. Washington and its NATO allies are desperate to make something happen now while they still can. Thus, the military expansion, the encirclement of Russia, yeah, right, you're fine there. The encirclement of Russia and China, and the aggressive provocations of Russia by the coup in Ukraine. Okay, now we're here. No, back one. Back one. Yep, right there, that's good. The U.S. is also encircling China. Obama and Clinton announced a pivot into the Asia Pacific. The other way. Well, yeah, right there. 60% of U.S. military forces are moving into the Asia Pacific, much of it justified by the fear trumped up about North Korea. As a result, more barracks for U.S. troops are needed, more airfields for U.S. warplanes are needed, and more ports of call are needed for our U.S. warships. At the very northern part of Australia is Darwin, where new barracks have been built for U.S. Marines that have been stationed there. And down in the middle, in central Australia, is a U.S. NSA spy base called Pine Gap. Pine Gap has been upgraded to not only do NSA surveillance of the entire Asia-Pacific region, but also missile defense and drone targeting for the Pentagon. At Guam, bases are being expanded for more warplanes, more ships, more missile defense systems, and U.S. troops. In Okinawa, where the U.S. has a plethora of bases, new bases are being built on top of the existing ones. And at Ora Bay, at a place called Camp Schwab, twin runways are being built for U.S. warplanes, going out over a bay, a pristine bay, where endangered coral, and endangered sea mammals called dugongs live. The people there have been resisting now for a long time. Veterans for Peace sent 2 delegations in the last couple years. We joined the resistance at Camp Schwab gates against these base expansion there. Other bases across Okinawa are being expanded as well, as I said. On Jeju Island, South Korea, a 500-year-old fishing and farming village has been torn apart to build a Navy base for U.S. warships, nuclear submarines, aircraft carriers, and U.S. Navy Aegis destroyers. The people worship this area of the coastline called Gurumbi. This is where they worship their relatives. They worship nature for 500 years. This is where our global network people, we were invited to come there for one of our annual meetings by the village, the Gagnon village it's called, population 2,000. Before this place had been dynamited and concrete had been poured on top of it. We crawled under razor wire and were arrested in support of the people. But now the Navy base has been built, and the first Navy Aegis destroyer arrived there just a couple weeks ago. People in kayaks went out to protest. People stood on the land protesting. A Veterans for Peace delegation, this is the one that Barry was in. We joined the people protesting there and at the front gate as the base was being constructed. But imagine at this place protesting for 10 years straight, day and night for 10 years. Can you imagine in America trying to get people to come out day and night for 10 years, 5 years, 1 year, 1 month, 1 week? If we get people once a month, right, we're feeling good. What's the difference? Why are people spending 10 years of their life doing this? This is the recent arrival of the U.S. Navy Aegis destroyer. You can see the two kayaks there approaching it. The U.S. THAAD, T-H-A-A-D, it stands for Theater High Altitude Aerial Defense, another missile defense system, is being deployed in a village called Songju, South Korea. And for the past year, they have been protesting day and night. 2 THAAD batteries arrived in the middle of the night just very recently. Thousands of police came out to block protesters from the village who tried to get in the road to stop the arrival of these. This was done just before the recent election of the new President Moon, his name is. He's a progressive. You might recall that the former president, a right-wing puppet of the U.S., President Park, the daughter of former dictator, brutal dictator in South Korea that the U.S. had installed, she was impeached. President Park was impeached for crimes against the people. And so just before the new election, when it was clear that this progressive was going to win, and he was opposed to these THAAD deployments, the U.S. in the middle of the night snuck the THAAD deployment in. The radar reaches into China and Russia. People are saying that actually THAAD would never work to intercept any missiles from North Korea. It's called Theater High Altitude Area Defense. And so that means that North Korea is too close, and that if they fire a missile at Seoul, it's not going to go to a high altitude. It's going to go very quickly on a lower altitude. So it's clear from experts that THAAD has nothing to do with North Korea whatsoever, but it is in fact aimed at China and Russia. So people have been coming from all over the country, joining protests in Songju to oppose this program. They understand what it's about. So we've got to ask the question, who's the real aggressor here today in Korea? North Korea or the United States? The global network Keep Space for Peace Week in October, something we do every year. This year, our theme is No THAAD in Korea. So we urge you to consider holding a public event during Keep Space for Peace Week to protest the U.S. deployment of missile defense around the world, and particularly the missile defense system going into Songju. On the table outside, we have our newsletters, and we also have these posters. You're welcome to take some. This is a chart done by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. And I think it's really instructive to take a look at it. 2016 military spending levels. When you look at the United States, 36% of the world total of military spending, and you add in the NATO countries to it, you get more than 50% of the world total, US and NATO, more than 50%. And look at Russia, 4.1%. So tell me, how in God's name could Russia be any danger to the United States or even Europe at 4% of the world's spending, military spending? In fact, this year and last year, so 2016 and 2017, Russia has reduced their military budget. We'd never hear that, though, on NPR or MSNBC, would we? So how do we stop endless war as long as our communities are addicted to military production? This is something that we heard earlier today. So we need to start and increasingly demand the conversion of the military-industrial complex. For the past 10 years in Bath, where I live, we've been running a campaign calling for the conversion. And we bring this message to the workers and to the greater community at large. Studies show that if we would build rail systems at Bath Iron Works, we would double the jobs that we get. Because military spending is capital intensive. It uses up a lot of money and creates fewer jobs than if we would do anything else. Building rail, building solar, building wind turbines, tidal power systems, building hospitals, schools, hiring teachers, nurses, or whatever. In every case, we'd get more jobs if we converted the military-industrial complex. So you think in a country that is job scared, we'd be talking about this. You think the politicians would be lined up talking about this as well. But it's not something that they ever want to hear. Here we go. Look at the trains we have here in America. So we've been getting artists involved because I know myself, I'm a visual learner. I'm not really an intellectual. I really need to see something to understand it. So we have a group of artists in Maine. It's called the Union of Maine Visual Artists. And they have a committee that makes banners for all kinds of progressive groups. So we've been asking them to make us visuals that we can use to help translate all of this for the public. And so we've taken these out to the people. Where I live in Bath, we have the largest 4th of July parade in the entire state. And so for many years, we've entered the 4th of July parade with various exhibits, including that particular one and others, where we try to bring this message to the people of our community. The last 2 times they christened a destroyer, twice in the last year at Bath Iron Works, we've been arrested and had trials, one trial and another trial coming up very soon. And I can say that we've been getting tremendous support from Veterans for Peace members from other states. We're very grateful for that. But by doing civil disobedience in this community that employs 5,500 people, the largest industrial employer in the state of Maine, it's a real controversial thing, as you can imagine, in a state with only 1.2 million people in the entire state. We've also been doing peace walks across the state for the past 5 years, starting at one end of the state and going to the other, staying in churches and talking to people along the way, handing out flyers, getting news articles printed. This is one of our recent walks. This is another one of our artist representations where we're trying to connect climate change, militarism, growing poverty, trying to tie all these issues together to show people that the military is a source of many of our problems today. This October, we're going to do another peace walk, except this time we decided we're going to stay in Bath for an entire week. And we're going to vigil at the shipyard in the morning and in the afternoon during shift changes, and then go door to door with a flyer, dropping the flyer to the entire businesses and residents in the entire city during that week, having panel discussions, showing films, doing all kinds of events to really try to rivet the community's attention around this issue of climate change being our big problem. We've got to deal with it fast. We've got to protect the future generations. And the way to do that is to convert Bath Iron Works, build solar, build wind, build rail, etc., etc., etc. So, one more. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, we'll have some question and answer if you want for a little bit. But I'm going to now present Bruce with our Kellogg Beyond Pack that we've been presenting to everybody for all your great work that you've done.
Thank you very much.
We'd like you to have that, hang it on your wall, and just hang it on the Bath Iron Works place.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll take this down to Bath Iron Works. We'll do that for sure. Thank you. So, yeah, let's see if you have any questions or comments or whatever.
There's so many things I want to talk about, but there were so many. But I was going to ask you about HARP, High Atmosphere Aerial Research Project. Is that related to all this stuff? I haven't heard this stuff before. I can't believe that Sweden, Norway, Finland, all these governments don't object to what the United States is doing.
Their governments have been colonized. You might remember a guy by the name of Zbigniew Brzezinski.
Yes.
Jimmy Carter's national security advisor. He was the one that came up with the whole idea of arming the Taliban in order to give Russia a black eye in Afghanistan, essentially where the United States created Al-Qaeda.
Right, I know that.
His son was the U.S. ambassador during the Obama administration to Sweden. And my friends in Sweden tell me that he was vicious, that he was a vicious Russia hater, that he demonized Russia nonstop during his tenure as ambassador to Sweden, and that he did everything he could to bring Sweden further into this whole program. So the United States is doing this all over the world, all over these places that we're seeing. The United States is essentially colonizing these countries, and they're losing their independence. Their media has been taken over by corporations just like ours. They're repeating the lies daily just like ours. So it's the same story in all these places. The myth of this progressive Nordic region is really gone. They're cutting social programs like crazy, left and right. They're expanding their militaries. You've heard Trump saying that they've got all NATO has to spend 2% of their budget on NATO weapons. Well, guess what? Every time any country joins NATO, whatever military hardware they have to scrap it. They have to get rid of it because everything they have has to be interoperable with U.S. satellite technology. And so that means they got to now go buy all new stuff from Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, et cetera, et cetera. And so that means then if you can force NATO to spend more money, then the profits of these corporations are going to mount like crazy. So that's the strategy right now.
Is HARP important still, or?
HARP is part of a program to essentially interfere with global communications, to also play with the weather, to use weather as a weapon by lifting the ionosphere. Chemtrails, which you might be familiar with, are also part of a program to begin to do geoengineering on the planet. And so there's a U.S. Air Force study some years ago called Weather as a Force Multiplier, Owning the Weather in 2025, where they talk about using weather as a battlefield weapon. Before we go attack someone, if we can make it rain, bog them down in the mud, they can't get their planes off the ground, or if we want to take some country's territory because we want to mine for gold or we want to take their oil, if we can create a drought condition there, have the population moved out, it'd be easier to go in and take control. So the military is doing all kinds of weather modification experimentation over the years as a military weapon.
That's what I'd say about that. If you watch the sky at all, it's regular. You can see it repeatedly there. There's streaking the sky. The monitor is a cloud.
What? Just one. Let Barry just finish this that statement up.
Yeah, so I've been talking to people about it for years, and they say that's just commercial airlines. Well, it's not just commercial airlines. It's the Air Force up there. And if you Google chemtrails, in fact, there's an activist, a woman that's a whistleblower about that, traveling the country, talking about the dangers to our health and whatnot. I used to talk to Ron about it, and he said, no, that's just from the kerosene in the airplanes. Well, that ain't what it is.
I highly, well, let me just say this. I highly recommend Googling Shasta, California, Board of County Supervisors, chemtrail hearing. So the Board of Supervisors, the commissioners of Shasta County, California, had a public hearing. And it was videoed, and it's now on YouTube. You can go there and listen to biologists, geologists, airline pilots, former military personnel, all kinds of professional people testifying about chemtrails. So if you have any doubt about it at all, I would highly recommend watching that. It'll really change your thinking.
The bottom line is what we keep doing is digging the hole bigger and bigger and bigger. And the no system is operational 100% of the time. And for every system that is developed, there are countermeasures, counter systems that are developed. And they might not come on board today, but tomorrow that might negate one of these giant things that we've just invested a lot into. And I've done some of this stuff for years and years. The Aegis radars started coming online about 30 years ago. I can attest to you that back in those days they could be defeated. And they keep trying to tweak their systems and make them better. But the geeks that will keep coming up with things that'll make them not work. When you're dealing with nukes, you don't need many that get through. And the odds of those spaceborne systems, it's all just a placebo to make people feel better. You know, we give Israel some weapons to defend themselves. Well, they don't have to defend themselves against anything very serious. They're looking at some ballistic rockets from Iran or Iraq, and nothing that's really going to hurt anybody in any significant quantities. But when you're dealing with big things, they can do a lot of damage. In Korea, putting that missile system in South Korea really means little or nothing, because there is no guarantee it'll work. A lot of those systems have not really been full-scale operationally tested. And in practice operations, it's known that they can be defeated. And you know, so we just keep digging the hole, trying to build bases and support structure and train people to operate this stuff or accommodate it. So that's the bottom line. If anyone believes this stuff works all the time, it doesn't. And even if it does work, you can't get them all. So the theory of some of the more primitive operations, like the Russians, is don't spend a lot of money, send a lot of cheap stuff. You can't get them all. So, you know, that's, the contractors make a lot of money on stuff that sounds great on paper and in the reports that they release. They're the DoD releases, but it ain't always that way.
Yeah, there's no doubt that these technical systems don't always work. But I've always said, you give them enough money and you give them enough time, they begin to make something work. And one of my problems with those that say, oh, don't worry about it, this stuff will never work, is that it demobilizes the opposition. I've been seeing that for years, because when people are told, don't worry about it, it ain't gonna work anyway, they said, well, why should I even, you know, work on this, trying to stop any of this stuff? But the way I look at it, humans have gone from throwing rocks at each other to shooting arrows at each other, moving to Gatling guns, to nuclear weapons. And so who's to say that they're not going to, over time, with enough money and with enough time, perfect new technologies to do very terrible things through space. So I think it's dangerous for us to just discount because of technological difficulties, which are real. He's correct, they are real, and they don't always work. But you know, when these guys can send rovers to Mars powered with nuclear power and drive them around, I mean, that's pretty amazing stuff. So I think that we discount these technologies at our own peril because they're putting the whole planet in grave danger. Plus, of course, the cost. You know, the Pentagon has long bragged that Star Wars, the generic name for all of this, will be the largest industrial project in the history of the planet Earth. And one time in one of the industry publications called Space News, they had an editorial where they said, you know, we've got to be responsible corporate citizens. We've got to come up with a dedicated funding source to pay for all of this, and we have. And we're now sending our lobbyists to Washington to secure that funding source. And you know what they said it was? The entitlement programs that officially in America are Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and what's left of the welfare program after Bill Clinton got finished with it. These are the programs that they've identified to defund to pay for all of this stuff. So on every level, we should be fighting against it.
I recall being down Huntsman, Alabama for your weapons in space. And I mean, I think we did send in and got that big 3-binder from the government, that big thing exploring the whole weapons in space program. And recently they, on the news, they said, oh, they had a successful shoot down of a missile up by Alaska. Well, as I recall, they were supposed to be successful with this years ago. And I was curious if it's ever been verified that they ever did have a successful shoot down of a missile, 8, 10 years ago.
Well,
Since then, anyhow.
There are different, I know I went through that slideshow pretty quick, but you might remember one early slide where I said there are various kinds of missile defense systems. There are what they call national missile defense. The idea is to have a bullet hit a bullet in deep, deep, deep space. This program, everyone is saying, will never work because in deep space, you are able to release balloons as decoys, and so your bullet going up to try to hit this missile and way out in space at 15,000 miles an hour is not able to differentiate between the real thing and the balloons, the decoys. So that particular program has a 0% success rate. But there are other missile defense programs. One of them is to try to hit a rocket soon after it's launched in what is called its boost phase. So if you're close to it, because you forward deployed your missile defense systems on land and at sea, nearby the quote-unquote offending nation, they launch it. It's got flames coming out of the back, easily identified, all right? It's slow as it's lifting off, so you can hit it in its boost phase, much easier to attack. Not flying at 15,000 miles, not yet releasing decoys and things like that. And then in the terminal phase as it approaches the ground. So there are various systems that are being developed. And so the idea of the U.S. is develop a system for every stage. For boost phase, try to take it out there. If you miss it there, try to hit it up here in space. If you miss it there, try to hit it in its terminal process. And they're also now talking about lasers in space, onboard satellites that would try to pick off things up in space, either another country's satellite or missiles going through space. So they understand the problem. They understand this problem very well. And so they're creating many different technologies to try to make sure that they have the capability at some point to try to hit things. But the idea is you've got to take out the other side first. You have to attack Russia and China in a first strike and try to destroy as many of their underground missile silos as possible before they're even launched. All right? Decapitation. And if you do that, then you reduce their retaliatory capability, which then supposedly makes it easier for quote-unquote missile defense to take them out in one of these various stages as you go along. So that's how the whole program is shaping up. Very expensive, yeah.
That kind of leads into my next question. We're so dangerously close to a war with Russia over Syria, and if the shooting starts, I'm trying to figure out the scenario. I think Russia's probably going to use their nukes first, so they either use them or lose them. So I think nuclear war would develop very quickly. I was just wondering what you thought, how that would play out.
Well, I don't know. I don't know any more than anybody else does, any more than the Pentagon does, or maybe even Russia. But I think Russia is repeatedly begging us. My reading of Putin is that he's been pretty rational. He's been pretty pragmatic. He's gone repeatedly to try to make negotiations work. The whole Iran nuclear weapons deal wouldn't have happened without Putin's intervention. He was a big player in making that happen. Obama took a lot of credit for it. John Kerry took a lot of credit for it. But Putin was a key player in all that. to try to create some stability in the region. So I think Putin over and over again, my reading of him, is that he's trying to really negotiate with the United States, calm things down, going the extra mile. I mean, everything that's been happening in Ukraine, it's unbelievable. But you hear all the time that Russia has occupied Ukraine. Russia has invaded Ukraine. It's not true. It's unbelievable. But so I don't know what's going to happen. But I do say that Russia has shown that they know what war really looks like. Okay, after World War II, they experienced it. And they have said quite openly, we're not going to allow our people to suffer like that again. And if you come at us, we're going to fight you. And usually we like to invade pipsqueaks, right? Grenada, Panama, even Libya, Yugoslavia. But if we go after Russia or China, even China, we're really asking for trouble.
One of the, happiest moments, well, it was the happiest moments ever in the peace movement that I've been involved in was about a mile or two from my house. Watching the people in the streets, I think this was 1990, waving at an airplane. The airport was shut down, the roads were shut down. Gorbachev was leaving the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport. And people were waving all over the place, happy to see him. Those same people wouldn't lift their finger to sign a nuclear freeze petition. They wanted things, done after the fact, What you brought up about the missile defense system is so important because that very thing was the reason why when Reagan met, for disarmament with Gorbachev, that was the sticking point, as you well know, with the Star Wars. Do you feel that if we were to go back, right now, to rid ourselves of that missile defense system, given the pressure from the UN treaty, given with Pope Francis coming out, what he's saying, do you think that possibility can come about again?
Not today. Not at this moment we're in, because we have no movement to force our government to that point. Let's be honest about it. We don't. Mostly, the peace movement is an aging movement. Many of the Democrats, when Obama, in my sense of it, was elected because of the peace movement, because the people were fed up with Bush's shock and awe of Iraq. Obama rode the anti-war horse into the White House, got off it, they put it in the barn, they locked the barn door, they threw away the key. All right? And we've been at it ever since, and it's getting worse. But a lot of Democrats that were part of the movement, this is from my own personal experience. Now, I don't know about Minnesota, but I'll talk about where I was living in Maine. A lot of Democrats that were part of the peace movement, after Obama got elected, they're gone and we haven't seen them since. Okay? And now that Hillary lost to Trump, they're spending all their time demonizing Russia. Even Barbara Lee, you all know who Barbara Lee is, the congresswoman from Oakland. Just the other day, she came out with a diatribe against Trump for even sitting down and talking with Vladimir Putin. This is from a super radical liberal, Democrat from Oakland, California. But this is how bad it's gotten. So I think right now we're hanging really by the edge of our fingernails. And it's a really, really dangerous time. I can't figure out where Trump is coming from. I can't figure out if he has a soul. I can't figure out what his positions are on anything. It's just unbelievable. And so if you're Russia meeting with Trump, what the hell do you believe? 1 minute he extends his hand in a friendly gesture to Putin, and then the next minute, they're calling him names. So I can't imagine what Russia and China think right now. So they've got to be prepared for the worst. And that's what they're doing. They're preparing for the worst with their very limited expenditures. China at 13% of the world total in 2016, Russia at 4%. But they're doing their best and preparing to make sure that we can't take over their country. See me afterwards, yeah. Send me an email. My newsletter is out on the table. Send me an email. Yep. Yep.
Your overview, I think, was very impressive and highlights the importance of what I call sins of omission. You know, so we hear Korea had this missile test, but we don't hear that the year before the U.S. had a missile test
A month
directed
before.
specifically toward North Korea, and by the way, that also was in range of China. So that's what we didn't hear. And I think it's important that anytime we hear something negative, you know, there's these bad guys or bad countries, to try to seek out the voice of what I call the other, the enemy, in, you know, as directly as possible. So, like with Russia, it would be Putin himself. Charlie Rose has interviewed Putin a couple times, and he's interviewed Assad. And there's Russia. What RT was it? Russia
Yeah.
Today. Russia
Yeah.
Today. That can also give a different perspective than we normally hear about regarding Syria. Regarding Iran, there's Press TV. Global research that comes out of Montreal
Yeah.
is a good general source for giving alternative perspectives. I don't have a good source regarding North Korea. I was wondering if you have any ideas, but I'm thinking we need to keep this in mind. Anytime we hear something negative about these bad guys, go seek out the voice of these bad guys and see what they have to say before we come to conclusions about anything.
Well said. I would recommend for Korea, general Korea stuff, Zoom in Korea, all one word. It's a website put out by some friends of mine, Korean Americans, that are really on top of all of the Korea, both North and South issues. So Zoom in Korea, it's excellent. I also highly recommend a U.S. source. Some of you probably know Robert Perry, a longtime journalist, helped break the story on the Iran-Contra story back in the Reagan days. He has a site called Consortium News. It's really fabulous. He has some really great writers that cover a lot of foreign policy and domestic policy issues. So Consortium News, I recommend. I was recently, right after that last North Korean test, I got a call by RT. They wanted to interview me on Skype. I did it. They asked me what I thought about it, and I said much of what you said. Where are you? Oh, there you are. Much of what you said. I said the United States is the biggest hypocrite on the entire planet Earth. We just weeks before, from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, launched a Minuteman nuclear missile, which we do regularly, by the way, from California into Kwajalein Atoll in the Pacific. So we're practicing nuking Russia and China and North Korea from Vandenberg in California. We do it all the time. We do missile defense tests all the time, all right? But that's okay, because we're the good guys. It's okay that Britain or France or Israel launches nuclear missiles. That's okay, because we're the exceptional good guys, all right? But, oh my God, don't let any of those bad, crazy people dare ever launch a missile. You know, I want to tell you a story. On my flight here, I was sitting next to a big, tall guy. He must have been like 6'8" in an Army uniform on the plane. And so I asked him, you know, hey, where are you heading? You know, and he's from Duluth. He's the city engineer in the city of Duluth engineering government, local government engineering department. He's in the reserves. He was just coming from a meeting, Army Reserves. He was coming from a meeting at the Pentagon. And so we were talking, and I said, are you worried about the U.S. war with Russia? He said, no, not at all. I'm concerned about that crazy guy in North Korea. I said, oh, really? Why do you say he's crazy, you know? Well, you know, it's just, you know, he yells and screams and everything else. I said, well, tell me something. In the last 70 years, since the end of the Korean War, which is officially not over because we never signed a treaty, we signed an armistice. So that's one of the things that North Korea is asking, that we sign a treaty. Tell us that for you the war is over, right? Because for us it's not. But anyway, I said, tell me, how many times in the last 70 years has North Korea attacked anybody? And he said, well, I don't know. I said, 0. I said, but tell me this. How many times in the last 70 years has the United States invaded other countries? He said, he thought for a minute, and he said, oh, maybe 4 or 5 times. I said, try dozens. I said, who's the crazy one out there, right? One last bit to this story. After one of North Korea's missile tests a few years ago, I looked in one of the space industry publications. They had an article about it, and they were interviewing an American GI whose job it was to track that North Korean missile on our, with our space technology. And he was laughing, saying, it's so funny because North Korea doesn't have the space assets, in other words, the space technology, to track their missile the entire length of its journey. But we do. We're watching it. And we're not worried about that thing. It's like pipsqueaks, compared to what we got. And so I realized in that moment, this whole thing is a show. North Korea is a foil. North Korea is a foil to scare everybody, to excuse U.S. aggression, the U.S. expansion into the Asia Pacific that is really aimed at China and Russia. North Korea is just a toy.
I've gradually come to see, is this on? Gradually come to see as I've grown older that what the United States, as I grew up, they said that, Hitler wanted to take over the planet. We had to stop him. Well, I've learned, that we also had Americans who helped finance him. But aside from that, as we get to what's happening now, we see a pivot to Asia. We see this thing in Ukraine. It does appear like the United States is embarked on full spectrum dominance. That's the term that's been used. So, and I don't know that it's fair to ask you this question, but it's a question that's boiling in my head. So I think it's something that has merit to consider. That, okay, suppose these military industrial complex people, the deep state, the U.S. military is able to take out these other countries, and we do have full control of the planet. And what are they all going to do? Who are they going to fight then? I mean, what's the point? It's just, they'll take us out too, I guess, yeah. But it's just, I just don't understand how they can look into the future and see anything positive as opposed to trying to work together as with other people, because we are one human species on one small planet. And that just makes so much more sense.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm going to hold off my answer and give her a chance to go ahead.
Okay, this may sound like a stupid question, but I'm wondering, how do you feel about the truce treaty that other countries are doing around about doing away with nuclear weapons? Do you feel it's going anywhere at this point?
It's the one that just happened in the recent days.
Yeah,
at
I
the
just
UN.
don't know what's going on at this point.
Yeah. At this point, what has to happen is all those countries, 122 I believe it was, that signed it, they have to go back to their country and now ratify it. So that's the next step. So those that agreed to it, for it to really become operational essentially as a treaty, it has to be ratified in those countries. So that's the next challenge for people to go and do that. But let's go back to what I said earlier. What Russia and China have been saying for years to us, as we're encircling them with so-called missile defense systems, they're saying, forget about us reducing nuclear weapons, because it makes no sense. If Russia and China reduce their nuclear weapons now, they say, it makes it easier for the U.S. to do a decapitating first strike attack if they have less weapons, right? Under the ground or in the ocean or wherever else they might have them. So the less they have, it's easier for us to try to take out as many as possible in a first strike attack. And then when they do fire their remaining retaliatory capability, the so-called missile defense systems have less mopping up to do at that point in time, which makes it a little bit easier for them to do something. And don't forget that the American Pentagon is saying for years that there are acceptable levels of nuclear damage in America for us to still win a nuclear war. I've heard it myself, on C-SPAN, the Pentagon briefings, So this kind of crazy thinking is out there. So Russia and China, sadly, do not feel that they're in any position, as they're being encircled, to reduce anything. But I still think it's a great campaign to go forward. It needs support, but it must, I believe, be coupled with a clear articulation about the dangers of missile defense and the need to reinstate the anti-ballistic missile treaty that outlawed either side from having this advantage of missile defense. And Russia and China have been asking for that for years. Russia and China have also been going to the UN for years, all during the Bill Clinton years, during the George W. Bush years, during the Obama years, introducing a global ban on weapons in space. All these various offensive technologies, ban them, get rid of them in a new treaty. But the United States and Israel have been blocking that treaty development for years blocking it. Yes.
I appreciate everything that's been said. I always enjoy Peacestock. And I think our president, after all, he really is our president, Donald. He's such a weird duck that it's almost inevitable that he will actually do something that will be useful to peace. Like sit down and talk with Russia. He actually did that. So what does the American public throw against him? All the intelligence agencies that tell us those commies can't be trusted. Well, what if they can be? Because in fact, they lost way more people in World War II. They know better than we do how futile war is. So maybe Donald needs to be encouraged when he does the right thing.
Yeah.
I mean, we can oppose all the dumb stuff he does,
Yeah.
and he does mountains of that. But I think it's important for the peace movement to be flexible enough to find out and identify the good things that he does that we can use to try to do what's talked about here, saving humanity from our own stupidity. And all of this warring and all of the funding for warring looks more and more to me like kind of protection money. And protection money only works if you need to be protected from something. The enemy. Is it really communism? You mean just a different form of capitalism? A different way of thinking about capitalism? It was like Vietnam really was stupid war. Like my shirt says, it's only a country. And for my way of thinking, there's a lot of economic thought out there. And I'm pretty sure there's something between capitalism and communism and socialism that probably works pretty well. And again, we just need to look for opportunities as a peace movement, as humans trying to survive into the future, to encourage those positive things that Donald does, few though they be.
Thank you. Let me, just a couple minutes left. I want to say two things. This recent election, I've been calling it the mob versus the mafia. I believe that what we have in America now are regional oligarchies. Boston, New York, Dallas, Texas, Chicago, Los Angeles, etc. Regional oligarchies that sometimes are in competition with each other. For example, I think John Kennedy came from the Boston oligarchy, was killed by the Dallas oligarchy, the Texas oligarchy, for various reasons. And Jim Douglas's great book spells out many of those reasons. So this is what I think we have today. And actually studying Ukraine since 2014 has really helped me see this more clearly, because Ukraine is all about oligarchies controlling that country. And so as I look at our country now through that lens of learning about Ukraine, I really see it more clearly here, that what we have is a battle between what I call sort of the street mob, you know, the building trades mob that Trump comes out of, and all, versus the kind of Harvard, Yale, corporate, Wall Street, Hillary Clinton mafia. So that's what I think is happening in America today. And so I think, I don't think there's anyone in this room that falls into this category, but I'm sure we all know many friends, liberals, Democrats, who want to take a side in this current battle, but I don't think we should. I think we should say pox on both of their houses. So let me finish with this story that I think really epitomizes what America is today. And I believe it was the late 1860s, 1870s, in a neighboring state where I used to live called South Dakota, when my dad was stationed there. I lived at Ellsworth Air Force Base in Rapid City. And I became, as a youngster, consumed by Native history and culture and wisdom. And so I've gone back there many times over the years and have read many, many books. And one thing I learned was that at the time that Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse were brought onto the reservation, this was following the end of the Civil War. You can imagine that. The Indian Wars are now dying down. There was a little bit of action still in Texas against the Comanches, but it was pretty much over. And the military-industrial complex at the time was not very happy, because suddenly they went to nothing. And so what they did was they created a story. And in all the major newspapers on the East Coast of the United States, there were stories with artist renditions, fabricated stories that Crazy Horse had left the reservation and was back on the warpath, killing innocent people, raping white women, killing white children. And the American people, of course, were outraged. And they demanded that Congress do something to protect the settlers, the noble settlers out west. And of course, Congress did, and appropriated more money for more military production. While in fact, Crazy Horse was sitting in his teepee on the reservation with not a horse or a gun to his name. And when I think about that story, and I think about shock and awe in 2003, or when I think about Syria, or when I think about Libya, or when I think about Russia at 4% of the global spending in 2016, I hear that same refrain over and over and over again. And I remember what the native people said over and over again was, put your ear to the railroad tracks and hear the train coming. Thank you very much for listening.